Hey guys, welcome to the Perkins Podcast. I'm Alan Perkins from Horns Digest through the Scout Network. Don't forget to check out Horns Digest, where Chip Brown has 25 years of experience covering UT athletics. And also, if you would follow me on Twitter at Alan Perkins HD, I'd really appreciate it. And don't forget also to check out my YouTube channel. Just type in Alan Perkins HD in the YouTube search bar and just scroll down past the more famous Alan Perkins that exist in the world. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow. So today's topic is the college football playoff, and I'd like to hear y'all's thoughts, whether it's through YouTube message boards or wherever else, on this topic, because that's what makes college football great: the conversation, the controversy, and the passion that fans have for their teams. I will say that I feel very strongly about my convictions that I'm going to be sharing today, but there are facts that I'm going to be sharing, but there's also going to be opinion. And so, of course, anytime opinion is involved, there's no 100% correct answer, especially when it comes to college football. It can be spun many different ways depending on stats or your favorite team or whatever else, so I'm open for debate. I went to the college football playoff website just to look up the guidelines, just to make sure I was well educated on the topic, and this is what the website states as far as what the selection committee is expected to do. They're expected to rank the teams, and I quote, rank the teams based on conference championships won, strength of schedule, head-to-head results, comparison of results against common opponents, and other factors. Every FBS team has equal access to the college football playoff based on its performance, and no team automatically qualifies. So there's a couple things. The biggest thing is that in the statement it says, and other factors. So just as we've heard when ESPN does an interview and they're talking to members of the committee, it's very clear that they're very vague as to what they're going to use to determine the four best teams, and they're doing that on purpose to cover themselves, because obviously if they never come out and say what those other factors are, then they can kind of change it however they want. So I think that's interesting. It just allows them to do whatever they want. And then the other thing is, looking at how the committee acts each year, or the way they go about things, is somewhat of a slippery slope to go down, because you have to remember that the committee changes every year, and some of the members are the same, but some members change from year to year. So that also is going to play into the mindset of every single committee member of the college football playoff. So the other thing to consider for me that I've never really heard anybody talk about is looking at the strength of schedule, of course, but looking at it 4 or 5 years ago. And what I mean is, let's say Team A schedules Team B. Let's say Team A schedules Alabama right now. Well, they're not going to play that game for a home-and-home series for another 4 or 5 or 6 years, but clearly scheduling Alabama right now is the toughest matchup that you could give yourself on a schedule. But what if 5 years from now Saban's retired and Alabama is not that good anymore? That team could be much worse once Saban is not there. So I don't think that a team or a program should necessarily be punished for the fact that when that game comes up for an out-of-conference schedule matchup, when that game comes up 5 years down the road, I think there should be some thought process that is included in what was this program, where were they in the landscape of college football when they set up this home-and-home series. And I know, of course, you have to say, okay, what was the team like that you played this year? But at the same time, if I'm scheduling as Alabama right now, that's obviously the hardest matchup that you can set up for yourself when selecting opponents from across the country. So I think there should be some credit given to teams for saying, what was that program when they were scheduled? Like if someone had Texas on the schedule next year, well, if you had made that schedule back in 2009, and I'm not saying they did, but if you did, the program is completely different than it is now. So now it looks like a lousy win if you were to beat Texas and schedule them out of conference. But in 2009 or 2005, it would have been great. So that's something that I never heard talked about. You could say like USC right now versus the Pete Carroll era. Those are huge differences based on where those programs stand. So I think something should be taken into consideration for that, but I never hear that talked about. And like I said, obviously you have to look at what the teams were like this season, and you know, if it was a freshman quarterback versus a senior quarterback, and how many guys had just gone to the NFL a year ago, and now this team is weaker or stronger or whatever. So obviously you have to look at this year more than anything else, but I'm just saying a team should be given some credit for the fact of who is that program, what have they been the last 5 years or whatever. Based on the NCAA.com website, I looked up the strength of schedule, and this is the strength of schedule for the teams that we're going to be discussing today. Clemson's strength of schedule is 3rd, Alabama's is 9th, Ohio State's is 15th, Wisconsin is 30th, Oklahoma's is 42nd, Michigan is 44th, and Washington is 98th. So that's based on the win-loss records of all of the opponents compiled from the whole season. And I also did forget to mention, which is very crucial, that at the moment that I'm doing this podcast, it's 11 p.m. Central Time on Sunday, November 20th. So we're going into one of the last weeks of the season. So Michigan's about to play Ohio State. Penn State's about to play Michigan State, if I'm not mistaken. Alabama's about to play Auburn. And so all those games are coming up. So just so you have a timestamp of where we're at when I'm having this discussion. So strength of schedule to me is obviously a big deal, and I'm going to get into that, but I did realize that I also forgot to mention the current ranking. So right now, according to the AP, not the current college poll because that's coming out on Tuesday, but according to the AP now, late on Sunday, Alabama is 1st, Ohio State is 2nd, Michigan is 3rd, Clemson is 4th, Wisconsin is 5th, Washington is 6th, and Oklahoma is 7th. So Oklahoma's 9-2, Washington's 10-1, Wisconsin's 9-2, Clemson's 10-1, Michigan's 10-1, Ohio State is 10-1, and Alabama is 11-0 as it currently stands. So, anyways, going back to strength of schedule, to me it's a huge topic and a huge factor when deciding who's the best team, which is what the committee is charged to do. That is their goal as a group. So when we look at group of 5 teams like Boise State in the past or Houston this year, why do those teams never get respect? Because their schedule is weak. It's one thing to beat one or two good teams a season when you have an easy schedule like group of 5 teams do, or easier, but it's another thing to play a Power 5 schedule week in and week out. And that's an extreme example, but it's still important when you're splitting hairs, when you're talking about a team like Washington versus Clemson or Wisconsin, for example. You can't brush that under a rug. Who you play is obviously very important. When teams are playing UTEP or Portland State or Rice, that's a big difference from even middle-of-the-road 50 or 60th ranked teams. There's a big difference in that, and everybody knows that. Another point of discussion is, as a fan, if your team has a loss, I really feel like you need to cool your jets when you're saying things are unfair. If your team, or if you're a representative to that team or whatever, if your team wins out, then you won't be left out of the playoff. There's never been an undefeated team left out of the playoff, and you can't get mad when your team loses. The only time I feel like, as a fan, you could really get mad is if your team is undefeated and then they're still left out, like an Auburn in the early 2000s or something like that in the old BCS system. But you need to... The other thing is that if your conference is weak, like the Pac-12 or Big 12, at least by perception this year, you need to be blowing teams out, not just winning. And the College Football Playoff Committee website states that there's no automatic qualifiers of any type. So if a team like Ohio State, for example, if a team has one loss and they happen to be in the division with another team that beat them and they have a head-to-head loss, but that's their only loss and they don't get in, that doesn't mean that they aren't one of the best 4 teams. It's just coincidence that the team that they lost to just happened to be in their division and was also a really good team, but that doesn't mean in my mind that they're not one of the best 4 teams in the country. So now I'm going to start going over the resumes for the different teams, and so here we go. Alabama, they're obviously going to be in the playoff if they run the table and go undefeated, and possibly even if they lose. Their notable wins were against USC, A&M, Tennessee, and LSU, and then if they run the table, they will have beaten Auburn and Florida as well. If they do that, those are the other ones that would be added to their resume. I feel like even if Alabama loses to Auburn or Florida, they still have a very good chance of making it in just because they're the only Power 5 team that's still undefeated. So that's how I feel about that. Moving on to Ohio State. Ohio State's resume, their notable wins are against Oklahoma and Norman, which is the most impressive as Oklahoma's a top 10 team right now, and they blew out Oklahoma by multiple possessions. Ohio State also beat Wisconsin and Madison by 1 possession, and they also beat Nebraska. And then hypothetically, obviously, if any of these teams lose, all of this stuff changes. But hypothetically, Ohio State will have beaten Michigan if we're making an argument for Ohio State. If they beat Michigan, then that will give them another huge win on their notable wins category. One thing to note, if Ohio State beats Michigan, they're not necessarily guaranteed to make the Big Ten championship because Penn State still holds the tiebreaker. So that is one thing to remember. But I would still take Ohio State over Penn State if Ohio State remains at one loss if they beat Michigan and then they're out of the Big Ten championship and Penn State goes in. Because the game was at Penn State when Ohio State lost to Penn State. It was in Happy Valley. It was a come-from-behind win by Penn State, and Penn State had blocked kicks against Ohio State that led to points. And in my mind, that's the most fluky way to win a game. It's not as if Penn State went up and down the field on Ohio State, and I know it's part of the game, and that's how it is, and that sounds like sort of a homer approach or a defense of Ohio State, but I just feel like a blocked punt and blocked field goals, that's not the same as just, okay, my offense went up and down the field on you, you couldn't stop us. That's different to me. So to me, that one was a little bit fluky, and obviously it was on the road, which plays into that as well. And then even if you want to just say, well, they lost to him and that's just how it is, well, obviously losing to Penn State this year isn't that horrible of a thing because Penn State is doing pretty well for themselves. They're in the top 10 also, so that's not a horrible loss. Ohio State has been blowing other people out in their wins, and the other thing is they'll never say it publicly, but Ohio State might not mind missing the Big Ten championship because even if they beat Michigan, like I said, Penn State can still get in over them on the tiebreaker if Penn State wins this weekend. But Ohio State could avoid the potential of an upset in the Big Ten championship game if they don't get in the Big Ten championship, so that might be beneficial to them, and they could have an extra week to rest. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Looking at Michigan's resume, they lost at Iowa on a last-second field goal on the road. I kind of put that in the same category. All right, not kind of. I do put that in the same category as the Penn State loss, except Iowa's not as good as Penn State, but the fact that Iowa had to kick a last-second field goal and that Michigan was on the road in that game, that doesn't look as horrible as if you're losing at home. Notable wins for Michigan: Colorado at home, Penn State at home, Wisconsin at home, and then hypothetically Ohio State if they were to win next week in that matchup. Out than they'll be in. Clemson, their notable wins are at Auburn. They defeated Louisville at home, and they defeated Florida State in Tallahassee. Their loss was at Pittsburgh at home on a last-second field goal. So with Clemson, I hold that a little more against them because Pittsburgh is a little bit worse of a loss than, say, Penn State. And it was also at home for Clemson. And Louisville clearly could have not very easily beaten Clemson, but Louisville was inside the Clemson 10 at the conclusion of the game, knocking on the door to go ahead. So it's not as if Clemson blew out Louisville. And then obviously with Louisville getting their doors blown off by Houston this weekend, that makes the win against Louisville less impressive that Clemson came away with. Clemson has been underwhelming this year in a lot of games, just kind of not looking amazingly impressive. And the ACC is down, so that doesn't help Clemson either. This year, ACC is not having an amazingly great year. Most noticeably, Florida State has been not as good as they've been in years past. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and make a part 2 of this podcast because I've only got a minute left to wrap this one up. So please check out part 2. I'll continue talking about Washington, Wisconsin, and Oklahoma, and I really appreciate y'all listening. And I hope y'all have a great evening and a great week, and check out part 2, which will be coming up shortly. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.